Andy, Nicole, and Ronick.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Policing in Chicago. Today, we're going to be exploring issues related to public safety, policing, and surveillance in Chicago through a humanities lens. Our panelists are going to speak on the possibilities of using humanities-based research to lead social change. But before I turn the mic over to my fabulous UIC colleagues, let's pause for a second. And I want you to think about what safety means to you and what you think makes it possible. Many of us have learned to think about safety as something that's made possible by technologies like security cameras and crime hotspot data, places like jails and prisons, or people like police and the military. We learn that without gates and locks, without law enforcement, we should fear for freedom from harm from dangerous people. And that safety is worth billions of dollars and the sacrifice of lives and some of our most critical freedoms. Today, we're going to hear 3 15-minute presentations from 3 scholars who will give us good reasons to question these common logics and assumptions. But they're going to do more than tell us why we should be skeptical that surveillance technologies, prisons, and law enforcement keep us safe. They're going to help us think about who we mean by us when we leave our safety in the hands of the government. They'll also ask us to reconsider what we mean by safety by re-envisioning public and community beyond the boundaries of neighborhood, nation, race, gender, and sexuality. They'll show us how embracing our interdependence offers different possibilities towards safety, motivated by an ethic of connectivity and harm prevention instead of one of fear and retribution. They'll help us to understand why thinking about local safety also requires thinking about our relationships to the rest of the world. You may hear some terms and words today that aren't immediately familiar or that might be used in a different context than you've heard before. So one to really take note of is the word carceral, which broadly refers to conditions having to do with policing, incarceration in prison or jail, and punishment. After our presenters have finished, I'll pose some questions for them to answer individually and/or in conversation with each other. I'll then pass the mic over to all of you as the audience, so please don't be shy about asking our panelists questions that you're interested to hear them reflect on. Dr. Andy Clarno is going to kick off our discussion today. He's going to give us an overview of policing in Chicago, and he'll help us to think about connecting local policing practices to global conditions. What he poses ultimately pushes those of us who live in Chicago and beyond to carefully consider the implications of Mayor Lori Lightfoot's proposal to invest $1.9 billion into policing in 2022, up from $1.7 billion the year before. And he's going to help us consider whether that really helps us to build a safer city and a safer society. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Lucila, and thanks, Michael, for organizing this. Excited to be in conversation with all of you today. Thanks for coming. I want to start off with 2 points to help ground our discussion. First, it's important to recognize that policing in Chicago has always been an instrument of settler colonialism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and empire. The city grew up around Fort Dearborn, a colonial outpost established by the U.S. Army to secure the region for settler domination by policing and displacing indigenous communities. The Chicago Police Department itself was established in the 1850s by the local elites with the express purpose of suppressing the growing labor movement and disciplining the immigrant working class. Since the early 20th century, the Chicago Police Department has targeted black populations with violence and neglect to enforce segregation and uphold white domination. And Chicago's diasporic communities, from Puerto Rico, Palestine, and beyond, became targets of political repression for demanding an end to imperial and colonial domination in their homelands. That's the first point. The second point is that conversations about policing usually focus on the local police, but policing is actually carried out by a network of agencies that operate on a range of scales, from the hyperlocal to the global. Donald Trump, when he was president, often talked about sending in the feds to Chicago as a threat, but federal agencies have a long presence in the city. The US Army occupied Chicago during the 1894 Pullman strike. The Treasury Department worked with the Chicago police to take down Capone. During the 60s and the 70s, the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO agents worked with the Chicago Police Department's Red Squads to disrupt the Black Freedom Movement, as well as Puerto Rican, Palestinian, indigenous, and anti-war movements. Now, ever since 9/11, the federal government has sought to expand coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. And these collaborations extend globally, as demonstrated by the arrest and deportation of Rasmia Odeh, a Palestinian-American community organizer here in Chicago, who's been targeted consistently for 40 years by the United States and Israel for her commitment to Palestine liberation. These networks between agencies are not seamless. There are always tensions, contradictions, and space for resistance, but they are increasingly important for understanding policing today. Over the last 30 years, two interconnected processes have transformed policing in Chicago and beyond. First are corporate-friendly neoliberal policies that have concentrated wealth in the hands of billionaire capitalists while exposing the racialized poor to intense forms of exploitation, abandonment, and death. Economic and political elites have transformed downtown Chicago into a hub of corporate, finance, and real estate capital and enabled the aggressive gentrification of neighborhoods across the city, while decimating jobs, wages, housing, education, mental health care, and other social services and supports for Chicago's working class communities, particularly Black, brown, and immigrant neighborhoods on the south and west sides. All of this has intensified struggles and generated crises that make the social order increasingly unstable. Second, and closely related, neoliberal regimes rely on policing to contain these crises and to uphold these unstable systems. In other words, they protect the powerful by policing the racialized poor. While social services are systematically cut, we see an expansion of funding for prisons and police, border security, immigration enforcement, homeland security, and war. As Susila mentioned, the Chicago Police Department has a $1.9 billion budget for 2022. That's 40% of Chicago's entire corporate budget going to the police. And Chicago police are on the cutting edge of growing trends, global trends, towards the use of large databases, predictive analytics, and advanced surveillance technology. They also work closely with state and federal agencies, forming a dense carceral network that ensnares communities of color, working class communities of color. Flows of data, technology, training, and discourse facilitate coordination within this network, which operates through three interconnected police wars. The first is the so-called war on crime, sometimes in Chicago talked about as the war on gangs. This is used to justify police deployments to monitor, contain, and eliminate Black and Latinx populations by concentrating surveillance and violence in working class communities of color. The CPD, the Chicago Police Department, maintains a gang database that includes more than 134,000 names. It's expansive, it's a massive database. But 95% of the people on that database are Black or Latinx. 70% Black and 25% of the people on this 134,000 person database are Black or Latinx. It demonstrates that these databases, what they do is they become an archive of racial profiling by the Chicago Police Department. Moreover, the CPD shares its databases with over 500 agencies around the country, and it participates in joint task forces with the FBI and other agencies to track and target alleged gang members. Police overwhelmingly target Black and Latinx neighborhoods with strategies such as stop and frisk, and they flood the neighborhoods with troops, which recently the Chicago Police Department has renamed these operations surge operations, right, in reference to US military strategies in Iraq and Afghanistan. Local and federal agencies increasingly rely on an arsenal of advanced technology for racialized surveillance. Chicago has over 35,000 surveillance cameras in the city, along with ShotSpotter audio detection devices, automatic license plate readers, Stingray cell site stimulators, social media monitoring software, as well as predictive algorithms, social network analysis, and other advanced techniques of data analysis to police poor Black and brown neighborhoods. Second, the war on immigrants. In the United States, it seesaws between the Republicans' generalized assault on all undocumented immigrants and the Democratic Party's targeted attacks on immigrants who are labeled criminals or gang members. Chicago is officially a sanctuary city, which means that police are not supposed to cooperate with federal authorities to enforce immigration laws. But there are loopholes and exceptions to these rules. Until just last year, Chicago's sanctuary ordinance, the Welcoming City Ordinance, explicitly denied protection to 4 categories of people: people with felony convictions, with felony charges, with arrest warrants, or people whose names appeared on a gang database. None of them were eligible to receive the sanctuary protections of our city's Welcoming City Ordinance. And U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is one of the 500 agencies that has access to CPD data. From 2009 to 2018, over that 10-year period, ICE searched the CPD databases, gang databases, over 32,000 times to identify alleged gang members for priority targets for deportation. Flows of data, therefore, bypass the sanctuary protections and enable collusion between the CPD and ICE, even in a sanctuary city like Chicago. Moreover, local police manufacture the labels like felon and gang member in the first place by stopping, frisking, and arresting young people in immigrant neighborhoods and recording these stops in their databases. Finally, the war on terror, which has transformed policing by expanding the web of surveillance, encouraging data sharing, and enabling the militarization of local police departments. Many new forms of surveillance rely on and activate discourses of terrorism that target Arabs and Muslims. For instance, as Nicole will talk about, the state deputizes residents to monitor each other through programs such as Countering Violent Extremism, or the Department of Homeland Security's If You See Something, Say Something program. Right? Whenever a person reports something through that program, through that If You See Something, Say Something, what police create is called a suspicious activity report. These are collected at local police department fusion centers and then shared with the FBI. Of the people whose racial identity is listed on Chicago's suspicious activity report database, 77% are people of color. 54% of them are identified as Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, or, quote, olive-skinned. Local police, as I mentioned, share these reports with the FBI, and then the Joint Terrorism Task Force carries out further investigation of all these reports. Fusion centers, like I just mentioned, they're another new mechanism of data sharing. They're high-tech surveillance centers located in every state across the country, as well as in major metropolitan areas like Chicago. What a fusion center is it's a room within the CPD headquarters. Here in Chicago, it's called the Crime Prevention and Information Center, CPIC. It's located at CPD headquarters, and it's staffed not only by the Chicago Police, but also by the Illinois State Police, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the DEA, suburban police agencies, and other agencies. And the intended purpose of this is to ensure flows of data, such as these suspicious activity reports, between local, state, and federal agencies. As part of the global war on terror, the U.S. has also established new mechanisms for sharing data and intelligence with partners such as Israel to support U.S. imperial projects around the world. So in short, policing in Chicago remains grounded in the dynamics of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and empire. While growing inequality deepens the crises confronting racialized poor populations in Chicago, these 3 police wars are deployed to contain the crises, and they've all intensified the repression and surveillance of communities that police have long targeted: working class, Black, indigenous, immigrant, and diasporic communities of color. We see similar dynamics around the world: extreme inequality, concentrations of racialized poverty, and repressive forms of policing. Fortunately, there's another pattern that is also historically consistent, and that's resistance. While some call for reforms of the police, a wave of abolitionist movements and transformative justice projects has taken root in Chicago over the last 10 years, with the rise of organizations such as Black Youth Project 100, We Charge Genocide, the Let Us Breathe Collective, Asada's Daughters, Organized Communities Against Deportation, Good Kids Mad City, Circles and Ciphers, Love and Protect, and many more. Rather than working in silos, these movements embrace a vision that Barbara Ransby, our colleague Barbara Ransby, and Ella's daughters refer to as political quilting. Political quilting describes the work involved in stitching together different movements to create a united front. Working together, these organizations have built mass movements to stop the construction of a new police academy, to end the use of countering violent extremism, to abolish gang databases, to cancel the ShotSpotter contract, to remove police from Chicago schools, and to defund the CPD. While much of this work is intensely local, many of these organizers also embrace an internationalist vision and a critique of policing as a global project. They're connected to national and transnational networks of solidarity between movements fighting for liberation, justice, and decolonization. Through principled forms of joint struggle and solidarity, these movements are providing global visions of abolition that stretch from local police and private security companies to federal immigration authorities and national security agencies, to the prison and military industrial complexes, and ultimately to the racial capitalist US empire itself. Excuse me, we can talk more about those movements, but I see hope in that, in that those forms of joint struggle and the visions being articulated by young people in the city today. Thank you.
Next, Dr. Nicole Wynn is going to press us to think about how ideas about national security and terrorism shapes local law enforcement practices. She sheds light on how normal, everyday activities, like growing facial hair or teenagers who express feeling out of place, are criteria used by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and local police departments to identify Muslim people as supposedly terrorist risks. Dr. Wynn will cover how the Illinois Department of Public Health, UIC, and the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority collaborated to promote this mode of terrorist identification and intervention as an alternative to traditional punitive policing. And she shows us how so-called data-driven scientific approaches to community policing and alternatives to policing still draw on racist stereotypes about terrorism and terrorists.
All right, good morning, everyone. Okay, so across US history, federal, state, and law enforcement agencies have turned to community policing as a way to perceptively reform or end coercive, rogue, and unjust policing. Confronting increasing social unrest, such community policing models have sought to repair the police's image, reputation, and capacity to solve crimes, particularly in communities of color, contesting police brutality, racial profiling, and constant surveillance. After the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings, for example, President George H. Bush initiated Operation Weed and Seed to weed out criminals and seed community revitalization projects. To do so, Operation Weed and Seed forced communities to comply with and participate in local policing to gain access to sorely needed resources. According to the Justice Department, this community-oriented policing initiative, quote, bridged weeding and seeding strategies. Officers obtained cooperation and information from area residents, while they assisted residents in obtaining information about community revitalization and resources. So in this model, community revitalization projects can strengthen the police's capacity to arrest, detain, and incarcerate through these intelligence gathering activities. And so what we learned from the 1990s and certainly earlier iterations was that community policing by design expands police powers while appearing to rein in coercive practices and enhance access to social services. And given the perceived rise of homegrown terrorism and intensifying concerns about the abrogation of civil liberties in pursuit of national security, the US security state has sought to apply community policing models like Operation Weed and Seed to the problem of terrorism. In this view, can I get my water? Sorry. It's graduation weekend. I'll blame it on So in this model, community revitalization projects, oh, did I just say that? So the U.S. security state has sought to apply community policing models like Operation Weed and Seed to the problem of terrorism. In this view, cultivating community partnerships and developing community trust may lead to increased reporting of suspicious activity, as Andy mentioned, as well as information sharing, target hardening, and improved coordination by leveraging the strength of communities and their members. Police strategists themselves have argued that community members are what they refer to as an important force multiplier, especially as local law enforcement agencies have become increasingly important in providing for the national security of the United States. In 2007, for example, the Los Angeles Police Department's Counterterrorism Bureau proposed using US Census data and other demographic information to pinpoint various Muslim communities and then reach out to them through social services. So through this initiative, the LAPD sought to map Muslim communities under the auspices of providing social services while documenting what the department perceived to be quote-unquote hotbeds of extremism. In doing so, Deputy Police Chief Michael Downing reported, quote, "It is our hope to identify communities within the larger Muslim community which may be susceptible to violent ideologically based extremism and then use a full spectrum approach guided by an intelligence-led strategy." So by aligning its community outreach with broader national security goals, the LAPD pursued a full spectrum, intelligence-led counterterrorism approach specifically in Muslim communities perceived to be uniquely vulnerable to terrorist radicalization. So in this anti-Muslim national security approach, the provision of social services operates as a key tool in the domestic war on terror by using social services to expand police power and police access. As a national counterterrorism senior official officer explained to me, quote, "Families, peers, strangers, and trusted authorities like your wrestling coach, your Sunday school teacher, your imam, and your school official could deter vulnerable youth from terrorist violence by providing, quote, resources they need as a part of the healing process." So instead of, quote, immediately incarcerating terrorist threats, law enforcement agencies have collaborated with these so-called trusted authorities who could use their daily interactions with their clients to identify and report potential violent actors and then to provide interventions that allegedly off-ramp individuals from the perceived pathway to violent extremism. In this national security approach, the provision of what security professionals refer to as pastoral care offers a new way to fight homegrown terrorism, whereby social service providers and community members serve as co-producers of national security. And this approach would come to be known in the United States as countering violent extremism, or CVE. For example, the Denver Police Department argue that, quote, terrorist groups target isolated and alienated youth for recruitment, leading to a partnership with Goodwill Industries to counter this recruitment tactic by preventing the initial isolation. So leveraging its partnership with Goodwill Industries to prevent terrorist recruitment, the Denver Police Department conducted refugee and immigrant outreach, offered mentoring services to disenfranchised youth, quote unquote, not well integrated into their communities, and finally engaged, quote, faith communities, Black Lives Matter, diverse communities, refugee communities, and LGBTQ communities, among others facing disenfranchisement by society. So the targeting of minoritized groups as incipient terrorists here is clear. To support communities in co-producing national security, law enforcement agencies, academics, and policymakers have developed tools to evaluate individuals who may be at risk of terrorist radicalization and recruitment. The NYPD, for example, reported that growing a beard, wearing traditional Islamic clothing, and giving up what they call urban hip-hop gangster clothes are, quote, typical signatures that suggest progression along the radicalization continuum. The FBI similarly provided a preliminary list of indicators to identify an individual going through the radicalization process, including wearing traditional Muslim attire, growing facial hair, frequent attendance at a mosque or prayer group, travel to a Muslim country, increased activity in a pro-Muslim social group or political cause. Other security experts argue that common Muslim sayings like inshallah were red flags or warning signs of radicalization. So we can see how anti-Muslim racism is sort of baked into CVE. Minneapolis law enforcement officials cited disaffection, a deepening disconnect between youth and their religious leaders, internal identity crises, and a lack of opportunity as the so-called root causes of radicalization among Somali youth. Again, these are all common experiences that only arouse suspicion when expressed or exhibited by Muslims in the United States. Although scientific studies repeatedly debunk and disprove these early warning signs, and I'm sure many of you actually have experienced some of these things that are so-called signs of terrorist violence, law enforcement agencies continue to use these lists to dictate which behaviors, vocabularies, and practices should generate suspicion within communities and initiate preemptive action to prevent violent extremism, including arrest and incarceration. To support these efforts, the Department of Homeland Security has trained community members and social service providers like mental health professionals, teachers, and social workers to identify and report individuals who exhibit the perceived warning signs of terrorist radicalization. And here in Chicago, as was mentioned, the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, or ICJA, received a 2016 Department of Homeland Security grant to establish its Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program, or TVPP, an alleged public health approach to violent extremism that prevents the disease of violent extremism or inoculates people from violent extremism. To do so, TVPP worked to develop and deliver a bystander gatekeeper training program to educate a broad cross-section of communities on how to off-ramp individuals who exhibit the warning signs of radicalization to violence, as well as those who exhibit behavior signifying they may be in the early stages of planning an act of ideologically inspired targeted violence. So in collaboration with the Illinois Department of Public Health and UIC, ICJA worked to teach social service providers like mental health professionals how to identify future terrorists. In fact, the TVP architect even coordinated with the FBI and Chicago Police Department, as well as Chicago Public Schools, in at least one case involving a student, to conduct a de-radicalization intervention, a revelation that undermines claims that such anti-terrorism efforts are community-driven and not focused on law enforcement. Despite this and other revelations, to encourage community participation in these trainings, ICJA suggested that its efforts served as a quote-unquote non-punitive and therapeutic alternative to coercive policing like FBI stings and preemptive prosecutions, thereby increasing community control over and reducing racial profiling in local policing practices. We also see this in Chicago Public Schools' turn to social media monitoring undertaken by school staff and intelligence analysts, which brings Black and Latinx youth into greater contact with law enforcement, like the gang school safety team, further institutionalizes the school-prison nexus, and ignores the structural conditions that produce violence, while appearing to provide alternatives to this contact through social service provision. And so this program, which is known as Connect and Redirect to Respect, tracks students' social media accounts to identify potential gang violence and then redirects youth to services, but it's often coordinated through the Chicago Police Department. So after decades of revanchist policies that have downsized social welfare while upsizing coercive policing, the US security state has reinvested in disinvested communities by transforming the public provision of social supports like public education and mental health care into a global war on terror weapon. Vying for new resources, police departments, social service providers, and community leaders have integrated this federal anti-terrorism model into local national security initiatives and caregiving practices. For example, Somali leader Abdi Mahdi reasoned that in an ideal world, you would want to have all the funding you can get for domestic programs, for social services, for women's empowerment programs, for soccer programs, right? But it doesn't exist right now. So given these economic conditions, Mahdi accepted money from the Department of Homeland Security's 2016 Countering Violent Extremism grant to fund after-school programs, even as community members warned that this amounted to community-led surveillance. Mahdi rejected these concerns, saying, quote, "It's bullshit. The parents are struggling with their kids' education because they're not educated, and the kids need tutoring. If someone else is willing to pay for it, let's go for the money." A civil rights advocate in the same community, however, argued that, quote, "Although this money is needed regardless if terrorism is that connecting dot, saying that this money would solve this problem makes it toxic." So in his view, a white parent who's poor in South Carolina would not send their child to T-ball that's called the anti-Dylann Roof T-ball because the assumption is that's for the bad kids. Instead, Muslim parents simply want to take their kids swimming, and that has nothing to do with CVE. Somali youth similarly assessed that they deserved access to these services as children, not as ticking time bombs. So although we all want to reduce violence, empowering community members in this way and aligning social services with national security exigencies in this way can intensify racialized policing and expand police powers, evidenced in the vigilante policing of Black people, such as Barbecue Becky, the white woman who called the police, reporting that she was, quote, really scared of a Black family barbecuing in California. So when innocuous behaviors like barbecuing are interpreted and reported as suspicious activity, we must question whether mobilizing community members like teachers to identify so-called concerning behaviors to prevent targeted violence merely intensifies such racial profiling and incorrectly assumes that the general public can objectively and evenly apply their suspicions, to say nothing of how these anti-terrorism and anti-gang approaches fundamentally misunderstand political violence and pathologize entire communities as potential terrorists, criminals, or quote-unquote hotbeds of extremism. So given this use of life-affirming institutions to expand carceral power, I argue that countering violent extremism, or CVE programs, constitute one form of carceral care work. Understanding how the state historically has responded to the criminal legal system's crisis of legitimacy by developing ostensibly friendlier policing programs to return to Operation Weed and Seed, the term carceral care work captures first the mobilization of care work to fortify or expand carceral power, the making of this care contingent on participation in or subjection to community policing, and finally, the activation of liberal narratives that frame these practices as a way to reduce the reliance on law enforcement and increase access to services when, in fact, they do just the opposite. So in the context of the domestic war on terror, the US security state has instituted carceral care work by mobilizing social service providers as terrorist watchdogs, by intensifying young people's contact with law enforcement through the provision of social supports, and by justifying these tactics as a progressive alternative to previous punitive practices. In Maryland, for example, CVE trained school resource officers identified and reported Muslim and Arab students experiencing homesickness, acculturation-related stress, and economic stressors, all which suggest they, quote, may be at risk of violent extremism. Minneapolis Public Schools announced plans to hire and train youth intervention workers who would spend time in the lunchroom and non-classroom setting, building relationships and trust through which they could spot identity issues and disaffection, believed to be the root causes of radicalization among Somali youth. So we see that in applying a CVE lens to their communities, teachers, youth workers, mental health professionals, and other trusted adults have come to interpret common immigrant experiences in the United States as signs of terrorist radicalization, requiring interventions facilitated by new community police partnerships. So as one form of carceral care work, CVE intensifies and expands, not mitigates racialized policing by further turning ordinary places like school lunchrooms and therapists' offices into sites of surveillance, and by further transforming social service providers into proxy national security agents. One FBI whistleblower also explained that through CVE, the US security state has used, quote, exactly the same terminology and methodology to suppress the labor movement and civil rights movement and now the Muslim community. It's political suppression. So from this perspective, CVE has continued the long US legacy of political suppression by targeting politically active communities of color as terrorist threats, from indigenous water protectors to Black Lives Matter organizers. So this long legacy bears on contemporary FBI practices aimed at policing political organizing through surveillance, entrapment, and lethal force, particularly in communities of color. And we see this in how intelligence agencies have categorized indigenous water protectors as quote-unquote jihadists, Black Lives Matter protesters as Black identity extremists, and in the last 2 or 3 days, efforts to categorize Students for Justice in Palestine chapters as hate groups, to repress, criminalize, and brutalize political uprisings. Although racialization and colonization are neither analogous or equivalent, these two distinct global systems of dominance and the various technologies of control and degradation on which they depend operate as conjoined state projects whose continuities bear on contemporary security regimes. In this way, domestic policing practices are intimately tied to US military operations elsewhere to expand US empire. We can see this in the construction of the enemy within, the budding Muslim terrorist that supports the waging of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So as the LAPD admitted, these alleged alternatives to coercive policing are actually force multipliers by deputizing community members and social service providers as proxy national security agents and police officers, a role many liberal helping professionals are actually eager to take on given the neoliberal erosion of social welfare and demands for care, not criminalization, and services, not surveillance. So this is really a warning that in creating care, not criminalization, our caregiving practices don't devolve into policing. And to close, I want to uplift the fierce organizing here in Chicago by the Arab American Action Network, the American Friends Service Committee, and CARE, which have fought and won the dismantling of ICJ's targeted violence and terrorism prevention program through a mixture of direct actions and political education campaigns. AAAN's work against CVE initiatives has continued, including the challenging of an $840,000 2021 Department of Homeland Security grant awarded to UIC for training and building capacity for mental health professionals and psychosocial specialists in targeted violence and terrorism prevention, really a continuation of ICJ's initial work. And more broadly, AAAN's work illustrates how communities can provide care, resources, and education in ways fully disentangled from the state's policing and security regimes, and how demands to abolish the police must include demands to abolish DHS, carceral care work, and ultimately US empire. Thank you.
Dr. Ronak Kapadia will close out the presentation portion of our panel by talking to us about how he understands global abolition, both as a history of movement and idea building, and movement towards a future in which we can all collectively survive and thrive. He pushes us towards the experimentation, imagination, discipline, and joy that's necessary for remaking a very different kind of world than we live in now. I'll ask you to pay close attention to the way Dr. Kapadia raises linked fate, as understanding that our struggles are always connected. And so the ways we think about justice, safety, harm, and vulnerability have to be rooted in an ethic of collective care and accountability. He reminds us that an abolitionist world, one where we don't rely on policing, prisons, and punishment to achieve safety, is one that's within our grasp if we foreground the everyday visions of those who are most marginalized within our current landscape.
Thank you, Sushila, and good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. You'll let me know. Someone will flag me if you can't. I can't see the audience, but I hope that you're feeling as pumped as I am after hearing those two brilliant sets of remarks. I'm delighted to be joining you virtually from the great indoors on the northwest side of our city on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Adawa nations, as well as other indigenous nations that know this region as their ancestral homelands. I want to join in the thanks to Michael Green and all of the CHF organizers and staff, including Kanisha and Daniel and others, for convening us. I love the opportunity to be in conversation with my brilliant UIC comrades, and I'm excited by our call to broaden our abolitionist toolkits for collective action when speaking about the state of racialized policing in Chicago. I think that nourishing our political imaginations is crucial to the practice of freedom and the desire for freedom dreams, especially amidst so much coordinated state repression and violence. It's in that spirit that I want to offer up 5 brief ideas to contribute to today's morning's conversation. First, this panel has offered a good introduction to what abolitionists want, what we believe, and why we are winning. It's important to remember that abolition is a productive, generative project, not only about breaking shackles and dismantling the modern world as it stands now, but about the co-constitution of new worlds and new horizons of being. For me, that entails a new world devoid of systems of power and violence that destroy the life chances of the most vulnerable, a world without prisons, policing, and warfare, which, as we know and as you've heard, do the opposite of providing safety, security, and care, a world without poverty and ecological plunder, where everyone has access to a social wage because governments actually invest in people rather than profits, a world that fosters restorative and transformative models of justice to deal with interpersonal conflicts rather than policing borders and cages. A world where educators, artists, activists, and healers are rewarded rather than punished for their labors and utopian visions. This world would be thoroughly queer, feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-ableist, and an anti-capitalist vision of the world yet to come. Second, it's worth noting that abolitionist struggles have foregrounded the leadership and intersectional vision of feminist and queer activists of color, especially in our city. This is not accidental, and we should be curious about this fact. Why is it that queer and trans, gender nonconforming, Black, Indigenous people of color are at the forefront of these movements? Abolition is a speculative, creative, experimental, world-making practice rooted in Black feminisms. Queer and trans working class people of color are legends within these spaces because they have already been practicing survival strategies and prefigurative practices in visionary fiction, mutual aid, harm reduction, safety outside the system, freedom dreaming. Abolition has a unique and complex history in the United States context, and we should commit to a radical study of its many genealogies, along with the study of other fellow traveler type concepts that are equally poorly understood and often appropriated, including terms like decolonization. Third, let us lift up the notion of linked fate, of shared struggles, and the internationalist and global visions of abolition. And you've already heard quite a bit about this already this morning. When we understand the US carceral state is not exceptional, but instead part of a global neoliberal racial regime firmly rooted in the histories of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, we begin to see some revealing parallels and relationships. In my own research, I've argued that thinking historically about race and gender and warfare in a transnational frame better reveals the crucial links between American imperial wars abroad and domestic forms of racial violence at home. As scholars of prisons, empire, and the carceral state have well documented, there is a long history of US government warfare on domestic populations of color. While this history of political repression against liberation and decolonial struggles in the United States and around the world is varied and vast, the militarized policing deployed against BLM activists today on our streets is not new, and it was never just a domestic affair. This is where the critical scholarship on US empire that Andy was noting becomes crucial to understanding anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-immigrant policing and imprisonment in the United States, as it better explains the tangled ideological and material links between the domestic and international contexts of contemporary global state violence and warfare. In short, to dismantle the carceral state, we need to also dismantle the national security state as well. More on that in a second. But first, a note to my fellow brown folks listening in today who are in the audience and specifically non-Black people of color. Let's remember that our past, present, and future condition in the Western world is inextricably bound to Black peoples in the Americas. We need to constantly revisit and refine our account of and solidarity with Black folks. That means learning about and witnessing their struggles, subordination, genius, and dreams. Disarming the police and divesting from the white supremacist anti-Black racist forces in our midst and in our minds, including by undoing the casteism and Brahminical patriarchy that's endemic to my own South Asian diasporic communities, which continue to make Black and brown political alliances difficult or impossible to sustain. In short, abolition teaches us that a commitment to dismantling white supremacy and racialized terror also involves dismantling all of the other overlapping systems of power and violence that face us, including heteropatriarchy, capitalism, transphobia, Islamophobia, casteism, Zionism, ableism, speciesism, and beyond. Fourth, turning the tide against endless policing and warfare also necessitates a critical embrace of the radical imagination and speculative thinking of visionary artists and healers in order to transport us beyond what the cultural theorist Achille Mbembe calls the great chokehold of the present. Our political imaginations have been so impoverished by decades of disaster capitalism and neoliberal warfare in the United States and around the globe. If our goal is to challenge the ethical common sense of US state violence, then we need artists, healers, and creative cultural practitioners of all stripes to be at the forefront of innovating new strategies of how to be in right relation, whether we call that mutual aid or restorative and transformative justice, or CRIP wisdom and care, or disability and healing justice, science fiction storytelling, indigenous migrant futurisms, all of these projects are central to what we might call abolition. And I just want to shout out some of the amazing Chicago-based art and activist collectives in our own city, the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project, the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which is celebrating today the 7th anniversary of an ordinance that's been put in place for survivors of police torture in Chicago, the Chicago Artists Against Injustice, the Just Seeds Artists Cooperative, the Let Us Breathe Collective, and countless others. I encourage you to learn about these organizations and help them bloom. Fifth, and finally, let me extend some of these ideas to our own moment, our pandemic politics moment of revolution, noting how our shared vulnerability in this moment can be a source of militancy. I'm increasingly convinced at this 2 years in that we should be talking about the coronavirus pandemic in the US as a form of low intensity domestic counterinsurgency warfare against minoritized peoples. The history of political repression against liberatory and decolonial struggles in the US and around the world is varied and vast. Yet one of the most signature aspects of all counterinsurgencies are divide and conquer tactics, efforts to stultify the power of organized rebellions against the dominant security order. How else to describe the past 2 years in this nation and other nations that are being led by increasingly authoritarian regimes where disease outbreaks are intentionally being amplified? When will we collectively acknowledge that the 21st century planetary wars on terror have come fully home to roost? So while the US policing and war-making regimes have long facilitated these sorts of murderous divisions in the general population, estranging us from knowing ourselves and each other, these forever wars also often produce the conditions of possibility for imagining otherwise. For instance, even as the pandemic has made touch and sociality ever more precarious and uncertain, laden with risk, we are seeing the revitalization of powerful forms of coalition and sensuous affiliation in the United States and in our city. We are witnessing the efflorescence of Black-led rebellion against the anti-Black carceral violence of the racial colonial state. These race radical freedom struggles are intersectional, internationalist, multi-generational in scope. They are queer and trans and feminist and anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist and anti-respectability and CRIP. A novel coronavirus that principally attacks the lungs and the vascular system has killed, as of this month, officially 1 million people in the United States alone, a disproportionate number of whom are Black, brown, immigrant, and poor, as militarized police forces shoot tear gas to suffocate the lungs of Black and Native protesters and their accomplices, working to downwardly redistribute breath on our streets across the nation. Could there be any more vivid an illustration of the necropolitical power of the racial state and its mortal claims to dominion or control over the insurgent body and its sensory states? This is a stark reminder that our senses, our embodied social lives, remain vital to any violent recruitment effort. And yet in the face of so much spectacular state violence, there is infinite tenderness and abundant abundant care everywhere in the air today too. Care in my throat too, 1 second. There's infinite tenderness and abundant care everywhere in the air today too. We've watched how organizers are putting their vulnerable bodies on the line for their comrades, passing out provisions like masks and hand sanitizers in the summer of 2020, rejecting liberal reformist co-optations of their struggles, practicing mutual aid as they tear down white supremacist monuments and extinguish the cops and courts in our collective hearts and minds. Powerful abolitionist experiments abound, if only we could transform our collective frequencies to better respond to their call. These rebellious uprisings represent urgent appeals to revitalize our political imaginations in the here and now, to become more experimental in our tactics and strategies of insurgency, to both the global ends of the forever wars on terror and their domestic reverberations, as we've learned today, which are felt most acutely through mass incarceration, mass deportation, and police violence in the United States. In this moment, when so many are closely engaging with longstanding Black-led demands to abolish the police and prisons, how might we extend these freedom dreams to conjure the abolition of the US military and the broader global security surveillance warfare state as well? We know that the police and the military are two faces of the same system of global repression and racial capitalism. So broadening our indictments of the US domestic carceral state to the overseas wars and militarized occupations would reveal the inextricable links between the domestic and international context of US liberal warfare and its relentless ruse of promoting safety and security around the world. So if the ultimate goal of global abolition then is the dismantling of the settler colonial state itself, a likely first step might entail defunding all of the US national security institutions and war-making infrastructures, including the Pentagon, the DoD, the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI, abolishing and reorganizing the bureaucracies of ICE while ending immigrant detention, expanding all refugee and asylum programs, legalizing all inhabitants of the United States, reallocating defense spending from all branches of the US military, which we know is the largest climate polluter in world history, to stop catastrophic climate change and address the pandemic of sexual violence across military ranks, ending the use of secret evidence and predatory prosecution policies, as well as torture, extraordinary rendition, and secret prisons like Guantanamo that lie at the legal gray zones of US military bases and global detention black sites, dismantling the corporate surveillance military technology dragnet and its interpenetration into civilian life, ending the militarization of domestic police and private security forces, challenging the ideological frameworks of global counterterrorism and counterinsurgency writ large, eliminating the funding and financing of arms and settler colonial occupations via US client states like Israel, India, and Saudi Arabia, participating in truth and reconciliation commissions, paying reparations to Black and Indigenous peoples in the United States, as well as Afghans, Iraqis, Pakistanis, Somalis, Libyans, Yemenis, Syrians, Iranians, Venezuelans, and other peoples of the so-called darker nations who have been targeted by US aerial campaigns or economic sanctions. All of this while also bringing together domestic race radical Black uprisings and indigenous struggles over land, resources, and sovereignty, with enduring decolonization movements for self-determination from Kashmir and Kurdistan to Palestine, Puerto Rico, and beyond. This list is long, the needs are great. A decolonial abolitionist litany for 21st century survival and rebellion indeed. Finally, I'd like to close with the words of the feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, who writes elegantly about the role of the so-called feminist killjoy. And perhaps we could say the anti-capitalist abolitionist feminist killjoy too. Ahmed challenges the depiction of feminists and queers and the woke more broadly as unhappy, bitter killjoys because they disrupt other people's ability to enjoy the things that are meant to make them happy. Killjoys wake us up. They are awakened. They are woke. I like Ahmed's concept of the feminist killjoy because it reminds us that to be engaged in downwardly redistributive activist struggles and social movements, connecting US state violence to the global stage, for example, is a labor-intensive, affective project. It is disruptive and disquieting. It affects us on the level of the body and the senses. She says, even talking about injustices, violence, power, subordination, can mean becoming the obstacle as the one who gets in the way of the happiness of others. Your talk is heard as laboring over sore points, as if you are holding on to something, an individual or collective memory, a sense of a history is unfinished because you are sore, unquote. Indeed, we are all sore today. Fully living that killjoy life is about making room for the soreness in our bodies and minds and spirits. Building an abolitionist killjoy toolkit is a survival strategy, a method of transporting ourselves beyond the dystopian here and now, and imagining alternative models of subjectivity, collectivity, and power toward the creation of a better, more just world that can and must exist. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to all of our panelists for those incredible and very provoking, thought-provoking presentations. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to direct a question to each one of you, though anyone can jump in if they wish. And then I'll have a question for all of you to address collectively, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So Andy, I'm going to start with you. Why should we be suspicious of language and practices like hotspot policing and other supposedly data-driven approaches to policing and reform. What does this hide, leave out, or misrepresent?
Thanks. Can y'all hear me through this? Yeah? All right. I'll try to speak up. Yeah, thanks for that question. So, right, over the last 20 years, there's been a real investment in, what's often called data-driven or intelligence-led policing. That's based on, that's really involves kind of the collection of massive databases, right? Like the gang database that I talked about, or suspicious activity report databases, other databases like that. Oftentimes this also involves kind of running this data through various different kind of advanced data analysis, right? Forms of advanced data analysis like social network analysis or predictive algorithms. And what's presented, right, is that this data is supposedly objective. It's scientific, it's race neutral, and it's presented as a way of kind of overcoming the legacy of racism in policing. But actually what a lot of the kind of the data-based policing does is it operates as a way of washing or cleaning, right, the racial practices to disguise them in many ways. So for instance, if we look at the gang database, the Chicago Police Department's gang database is right. The data itself is the product of police stops and arrests. So it's the product of decades of kind of targeted profiling of particular neighborhoods and particular people. As I mentioned, 70% of the people on this gang database are Black, 25% are Latinx, right? But once that data is there, right, once you have this database, then the police department runs this through predictive algorithms to determine where are crimes happening, where do we need to be deploying more resources, who should we be targeting, and what comes out, right, are these risk scores that are seemingly objective, but are really grounded in the racialized stereotypes and the racial practices. And so what ends up happening is, right, histories of targeted policing of particular neighborhoods, particular people, end up producing data, which gets kind of circulated through these predictive algorithms to become evidence that the police should continue to target the same populations and the same people that they've been targeting before. You can see similar work with the suspicious activity reports, right? As Nicole talked about, or CVE. As Nicole talked about, activating anti-Muslim stereotypes and encouraging people to watch one another and to report on people's activities or behaviors helps to kind of reify the notion that there are terrorists around us, and therefore we need more programs to stop them and to de-radicalize them, right? So what seems kind of objective and clean and data-driven is really like a wash in racism. You want me to?
Okay, thank you. So, Nicole, I imagine you're going to be building on this a little bit in your response. But you've talked a lot about how racist ideas misinform the policing of those who are not terrorists. But what about those people who are genuinely trying to cause harm at a large scale? Many people pointed to the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th as an important recognition that white people act as terrorists too, and that anti-terrorism legislation can be an important deterrent for white supremacy. But what would you ask people to keep in mind, and what would you caution them against?
Okay, can folks hear me? Yeah, thanks for that question. So I'm thinking of a few things. So the first is that, people's response to January 6th was we have to prosecute everyone, we have to lock everyone up, we need more domestic terrorism legislation. And Andy has talked about how, right, the roots of policing in the United States are white supremacist. And so it seems nonsensical to turn to a white supremacist institution to solve the problem of white supremacy. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that the idea that we can prosecute and lock up everybody who participated in January 6th misses the roots of January 6th, right? So does locking up a few white supremacists get at structural inequality? Does it get at structural racism? For me, the answer is no, while shoring up racist institutions like policing, like the courts, and so on. But I think this last point of there are people who commit acts of violence that get marked as terrorists, and for me, it's sort of the same response. Like, I think, we say close Guantanamo, but I don't know how ready we are to talk about the violence that some people at Guantanamo have committed as acts of political violence. And again, we don't talk about the politics animating people's use of violence. And so the solution has always been, let's lock violent actors up and not address, for example, the role of U.S. occupation in Palestine as driving certain forms of political violence, or U.S. Intervention in the Middle East as giving rise to Al-Qaeda, and that, ending U.S. empire is a way of ending political violence rather than we can just lock up a bunch of people. So for me, it's having a structural analysis and understanding the blowback that'll happen on communities of color. And I think the last example I'll give is that after January 6th, the FBI did away with the Black identity extremist label, and it created the racially motivated violent extremism label. And after January 6th, white supremacists got labeled as racially motivated violence. So you have black folks contesting police brutality and white supremacists in the same category. And so then the FBI will say, we're investing $70 million in countering racially motivated violent extremism. There's now no way to know, is that all targeting Black Lives Matter protesters, or is it going to attack white supremacists, right? So we know that expanding the carceral state will invariably target communities of color and really not get after sort of the structural roots of white supremacy.
Okay, thank you. I think that thinking through, the difference between what we think something will do and how those things end up playing out, each of you have touched on that, I think, in what we wish might happen and the difference between perceived intent and actual outcome. And that's a really important way to understand how policing functions as this, as a toxic force in our social relationships. So, Ronak, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how you painted this really poetic vision of global abolition and of a utopian future that I think a lot of us would really love to see unfold. But what's the everyday labor of making this utopian future a reality? What are the ways that we can all work towards global abolition, not just as an idea, but as an everyday practice through our intimate and community relationships?
This is such an important question. And first, I'm just, in reflecting on this conversation so far, I'm struck by how the conversations, the scholarship and activism within policing, the connections between the domestic and global, as we've all outlined today, has been so transformative over the last decade, 15 years, right? Like the early days after 9/11, the kinds of conversations that were happening then versus now. So I'm just reflecting on the sense of progress that I feel in our fields, which is the first thing. But to your question about the intimate and everydayness of abolition, there's a couple things to say. First is that, as a student of Black feminisms and other women of color feminisms, we know that, first of all, the state is a site of violence. It's not the resolution of violence. And that we need to connect interpersonal forms of violence to state violence. So that connection is really key and crucial. We need to think about the fact that the revolution starts at home. And so, questions about interpersonal conflict, as I was alluding to in my talk, about the way we think about the fact that anybody can be a perpetrator of harm and everyone can also experience harm. If we have that analysis, that changes the way we think about how to mitigate harm or how to get to the root causes of harm, the structural questions that Nicole was just broaching, right? So it's partly a paradigm shift about how we interact with the people in our lives, with ourselves, right? The way we talk to ourselves, the way that carceral logics bleed past prison walls, both to all of these policing technologies, as Andy and Nicole have outlined, but also in terms of our interpersonal interactions with people, right? As we move through the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to remember that abolition is a generative and productive project. It is not only about breaking shackles. It is not only a negative project as it's usually framed in people's imaginations, right? So when we talk about abolition, we're also mentioning the prefigurative nature of abolition, which is to say, we're going to make the road as we walk, right? That phrase. We're going to think in the here and now how we're going to build new systems, new world building systems that will get us to that eventual horizon of abolition. And so if we think in that sense that abolition is this creative enterprise, that it takes a lot of psychic, emotional, physical labor, right, in order to produce that creativity, then we see the centrality of artists and healers and creative cultural practitioners and freedom dreamers and people who are trying to think outside of the logics of the here and now, right? And so this is where I think, again, centrally, the importance of art and culture and imagination becomes really crucial. And so in terms of the everyday, it's like, what is our relationship to creative spirits? What is our relationship to freedom dreaming? How does that manifest day to day? That's something that everyone can have a hold on to without losing sight of that long-term arc of abolition, that long-term freedom struggle.
Thank you. I think that's the perfect transition into my question for all of you, which I believe we have 5 minutes to talk about. So no pressure. So I think it's really notable that here we have this panel on policing or public safety in Chicago. And we've got a panel here of people who are talking about abolition and not about reforming policing. So each of you has engaged carceral abolition in some form, even if you haven't explicitly named it that today. So clearly it's a part of how you're each thinking about public safety and the urgency of engaging different approaches than what we've generally seen in our world. So, and I want to also note when calls that some of you made, for instance, to defund or abolish, like the FBI, CIA, there's definitely some like shuffling in the seats and a little bit, I think, of notable discomfort there. So I want to call attention to it and really ask you all to talk about that. So to those who say that the abolition of prisons, policing, law enforcement, and military is unrealistic or too risky to try, how would you respond? What's wrong with reform? And what would your pitch be for the everyday person if you're trying to get them on board the abolitionist project? What pitfalls, traps, and distractions would you warn them against?
Okay, I'm going to start because I just want to say a sliver of something before really passing it off to Nicole and Andy, which is to say what we're doing right now is not working. And so that's just period, right? And we know that reforms have just meant the expansion of all of these systems of harm. And so if not now, if not during this period of pandemic, if not during this moment of global calamity, to try something new, to try to experiment both on a local level, but also at a national and global level, then when, right? So that's the first thing I would say. Where do we want our resources allocated in order to live the world, to live the lives that we want as part of collectives and commons?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ronak. I think part of an important piece of the vision of abolition is something that Miriam Kaba says, we want to make prisons obsolete, right? Make police obsolete. Like it's about transforming our society as a whole. It's not just about a single institution, but it's about, social transformation, fundamental social transformation, so that we can envision living in the world that Ronak was describing, right, in his presentation, that beautiful vision of a different kind of world to live in. Reforming the police doesn't do anything to address the underlying root causes, right, of violence, of the crises confronting so many people in our society. And what we're talking about is something that's much deeper, right? It's about really beginning by trying to transform the underlying crises that are facing people and communities across the city and throughout the world.
All right, so I think now that gives us a time to transition to audience questions. So we have someone who will be coming around with a mic. So if you have a question, please don't be shy, raise your hand.
And this isn't aimed for any speaker in particular, but do you feel like there are any countries or communities that have kind of started on this path or have seen success with it? And do you think any of the steps they've taken, kind of more concrete ones, are applicable to what can be done here, at least starting either in Chicago, Illinois, or the nation?
I can actually jump in here. So I think one of the spaces that we're really seeing some different work happening around is dealing with intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And we can see this, we don't even have to look to other countries. We can actually just look here in Chicago. We can look at the ways that people are thinking about gender-based violence differently and addressing it outside of the parameters and frames of punishment. So, and especially when we think about sexual harm, a lot of the time people think like, okay, the danger is coming from strangers lurking in bushes or in garages. And the reality is that the majority of sexual violence happens from people in our networks. So we have groups like Love and Protect, activists like Monica Cosby, who have said sentencing people who commit sexual violence to prison and jail just recreates other forms of sexual violence. So we know that part of the punishment of incarceration is typically being subject to some form of sexual violation. So how do you then address the root causes of this type of harm instead of saying, well, the appropriate punishment for people who commit sexual harm is to subject them to sexual harm? Because that doesn't do anything to resolve things. That doesn't address, again, the underlying problem. So healing circles, we see transformative justice interventions as folks coming together to talk about, well, yeah, there was harm caused in this particular interaction or a series of interactions, but there's also a broader picture of harm that made this possible. How can we address our intimate relationships, our everyday ways that we permit rape culture, patriarchy, these forms of hostile, toxic interaction? How are we each responsible for shifting that dynamic? And how do we give people who are survivors of violence space to name that they have suffered, to ask the questions they want to ask, like, why did you harm me? Did you not think about what this would do to my life? And bringing people into a space where they can have those exchanges and thinking differently about accountability. Accountability is about facing the harm that you've caused and working towards repair. Whereas sending people to prison and jail and focusing on prosecution incentivizes people to deny the harms that they've caused. So I think we don't even need to look to other societies to see how this work is happening. We just have to look in our own city. We have to look at spaces and places where people have said this is not working, like some of our panelists have raised. So what else might we have to offer? What else can we try? So we have to experiment because we know what's happening is simply not working. It's not enough, and it's not giving the people who are most harmed what they need to move forward in their lives.
It's called restorative justice.
Restorative justice and transformative justice increasingly, restorative justice approaches, we see increasingly that the state is looking to take that over. And so some people have also said, well, we need to do this outside of what the limitations of the state provide. So transformative justice, making this community-led and less so involving state actors. I think we're seeing more movement towards that as well.
On that, for the last several years, there's been a campaign to abolish the police database in Chicago, the gang database in Chicago. So the Erase the Database campaign, built by by Black, Latinx, Asian, right, groups coming together across the city that see the gang database as a pipeline to prison and to deportation. And so they've been calling for abolition, right? Demanding to eliminate the gang database. The Chicago Police Department's proposing instead they're just going to reform their database. But what we're also seeing is that over the last year, there's been growing energy within that movement, within those campaign spaces, to envision alternatives, right, and to propose alternatives. There's a group called Good Kids Mad City that's working with the Erase the Database campaign now. There's promoting what they're calling the Community Restoration Ordinance, or the Peace Book. And the idea is to provide information and support and funding for non-carceral alternatives, right, like transformative justice, to really address the causes of violence in our community. So there's work being done very much here, as Susila said, in the city. There's a lot of energy going into blocking these transformations from moving forward, but there's movements and there's buildings and there's visions and there's work being done right now.
Hi. I wanted to first thank you guys for the opportunity to be a part of this panel discussion. And I just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about one of the reasons I'm here is to also be a part of this, but as part of reforming, I am part of the team that works at CPD main headquarters in community policing, in the Office of Community Policing. And part of the team that I work with is we reach out and we've been engaging faith-based organizations, community stakeholders, regular individuals, restorative justice, and we've been engaging the community in the consent decree that was an agreement between the police department and the Attorney General's office for police policy reform, accountability, and transparency. And we've been actively engaging communities and regular civilian people into conversations and engagement of changing policies. Two of the policies we've recently had community feedback, and that feedback has been incorporated into changing the protection of human rights and the prohibition of racial profiling and other bias policies. We've been actively engaging in community conversations, deliberative dialogues, focus groups, where we've invited the public in to speak about experiences they have had, interactions, them, their families, even with as far as language that's been incorporated in a lot of the policies. And this has been incorporated and changed, and we've had an independent monitoring team that's monitoring how we've been doing these engagements. And I just wanted to reach out to let you guys know that while this may not necessarily be the answer to it all, it is baby steps towards trying to make sure that we're eventually bridging the gap and make sure that the community not just has a point of view, but their say, and it's been incorporated into changing these policies so that we can have some type of a better utopian society, as we always listen and speak to about here.
Was there a question in there that you wanted the panelists to address?
I was just kind of making, I was really in agreement with what you were saying about having the community involved and being able to get their perspective and experiences so that they can incorporate some type of change, because it's one thing to just police, feel some kind of way, but accountability and transparency, I was just trying to make a connection with what you were saying about we need to have community involvement in order for that change to eventually follow. Right.
Thank you. Did any of our panelists want to engage? No? Okay. Okay. Yes.
Yes, can you hear me okay? I'm actually in the trenches on this kind of thing. I'm dealing with a fellow down in Pinckneyville who is in his 19th year of a 53-year sentence and was essentially exonerated with a confession that was done 9 years ago. And the guy's still in prison. Public defenders are useless. We don't have a justice system. We need a justice system. I'm seeing an intersection of racism and capitalism that is horrendous. I see people of color being treated as cash cows. If you call out of a jail, okay, it's costing 23 cents a minute. You only get 15 minutes, but actually it boils down to 10 minutes. We have attorneys that are just taking money left and right, not doing anything in the courts for people. So I'd like to hear efforts towards transforming our society and dealing with racism, dealing with the corruption of the police. I mean, I'm dealing with a case in Boone County now. Supposedly they found an illegal amount of cannabis in a garbage can on the street outside the property that was used to get a search warrant for the house. And as they go into the house, the cop is overheard on the security cameras, turn off your cameras. He's telling the other police to turn off their cameras. And suddenly they find some heroin and some cocaine in the woman's bedroom. Her son gets taken away from her. It's been 9 months now. No cameras. She has tested clean every single urinalysis, including the very first one that the judge ordered when she was in court. We have a big problem in this. We have a law enforcement system. We don't have a justice system. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about transforming that system, transforming our society so that people of color aren't born with a target on their back. I mean, it's horrendous what I'm seeing there.
Thanks for those comments, for both sets of comments. I really appreciate this. I mean, I think what you're speaking to, right, that Department of Justice report, right, that led to the consent decree documented so much of that racism, that violence, that everyday corruption, right? And the Inspector General's reports have been doing the same, right? Consistently, every year, the Inspector General in Chicago is releasing reports documenting the terrors, right, created by the Chicago Police Department. And yeah, I mean, I think that this is exactly what we're all talking about, right? It has to be fundamentally transformed. Tweaking and changing this bits and pieces here isn't doing it, right? We have to address that those questions of capitalism and racism that are underlying all of this, and that the system is supporting, right? It's uplifting and maintaining a fundamentally unjust system.
So what are the recommendations to change it? We can talk about it, but that's not changing.
We've been talking about, you know, various visions of you know, transforming policies, abolishing police, creating new ways of organizing, right, our lives, and you know, visions that Ronak was outlining of from very local forms of mutual aid and, right, transformative justice happening, you know, in communities across the city to much bigger and global visions. And you know, what many of the movements that we're seeing today and that we're trying to, you know, work with here in the city and around the world are building real strong connections to one another, right? And thinking about how kind of the liberation of black people in Chicago is tied up, right, with freedom struggles happening throughout this country and around the world. And it's there. I think it's in those movements, in those kind of the building, the transformative work, the visions that's coming out of those spaces is where I see like the possibilities for real change.
Can I just say also, I know it's 12, the alternative never looks like a fully realized thing as people are blooming and experimenting, right? And it's easy to denigrate the alternative and to delegitimate it. And we're seeing that across mainstream media, you know, left and right, that every alternative that local activists, organizers, young people are proposing is ridiculed or denigrated or confused. So that's happening. On the other hand, we know that the police is the most visible arm of the state and its violence. And yet carceral power, which was all what we're describing, part of how it works is by invisibilizing itself, cloaking itself in all of these other systems. And so part of our job, and that's why we're all convened here today, is to make visible these systems of power and violence so as to undermine them. And that growing our consciousness in our communities, with our family members, with our kin, means making visible these systems, not only the harms that they produce, but also making visible the alternatives and holding on to the space of the alternative as something that's worthy and valuable and meaningful, because that's the only way we're going to get to that otherwise horizon.
And I think if to build on that, I think one of the clear things that we all can do is also engage in a politics of refusal, right? What does it mean to refuse to engage certain types of violence or normalized pathways, things that have become normalized as pathways to resolving violence or difficulty? So activist and scholar Miriam Kaba, one of the things that she talks about in her work is that, you know, young people in her local neighborhood or apartment complex, they would play music really loudly. And other residents would complain as the neighborhood was gentrifying. The police would get called in. The police would arrest the youth, take them to the police station, then call Miriam Kaba to go pick them up and talk to them. But at that point, those youth already have a criminal record, right? They've already had contact with law enforcement. So she then appealed to the people in that neighborhood and said, instead of calling the cops, call me, because that's what happens anyways. Let's actually build a phone tree. Let's talk about building relationships to each other instead of insulating each other and using the law as an intermediary for that relationship. We have to do that local work, that relationship building. And we also have to ask what terms that's happening on, right? So if we're having discussions, what comes of those discussions? If it's discussions with the state, is that happening where it's just listening? Or what are the steps to action? What do those look like? If they're baby steps, who gets to decide what those steps are? Is it appealing to those in power, or is it those who have been denied power that get to make those decisions? So I see the wrap up there. So I think that is probably a cue that we need to wrap up this exciting discussion for now. But I encourage you all to keep having these discussions and check out the scholarship of the amazing scholars on this panel. They and the organizations that they've worked with and highlighted do a lot of this incredible work. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you for being in attendance today.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Sushila. Great moderation. Great, folks. Great to see you
Thanks.
all.
Bye, Ronak.
Bye, folks. Take care.